welcome to our webinar about navigating sexual harassment, the mental health support and legal guidance that goes with it. We are joined by Ali Bailey, the intake coordinator at Lamco Wellness and a registered mental health clinician, and Morgan Ricketts from Hadsell, Stormer, Rennick, and Dye, who specializes in sexual harassment cases. And this is really about supporting the victims and the individuals who are navigating this type of situation, which is a very difficult situation, as well as practicing the emotional or providing the emotional, legal, and practical guidance that might be necessary. And then, as always, we would just want to encourage healthier conversations around these types of things. So, to get things started, I'd like to ask Ms. Ricketts, what misconceptions do people commonly have about victims or these legal claims?
I mean, I hear it all the time that people think, when someone comes forward and files a lawsuit over sexual harassment, a lot of people say things like, oh, how do we know? Maybe she just wants to get money, or she just wants to punish this person, or, get back at him for something else he did wrong. And really, I think nothing could be further from the truth. I've really never even had an intake, like a potential client, give me that vibe. I've never thought to myself, oh, this person's kind of making it up because they want to get paid or they want something else other than just justice. And I think that's because there's so much stigma, right? There's so much against a person who wants to step forward. So if they're already making the decision to reach out and contact a law firm, they've really thought about it and it's really a serious thing for them.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I feel like also one of the things that I think people overlook is they kind of look at the end product of, oh, potentially this person like gets reinstated or is awarded some damages. But the in-between product, in my understanding, and please correct me if I'm wrong, is a very invasive and brutal period, or can be. That it takes a lot for people to want to go through that, I feel like.
Yeah, and I think people even even as much as they think about whether they want to go on record, having a lawsuit and, disclosing publicly all the things that happen to them, which a lot of people end up deciding not to. Um, but even then, once they've made that decision, I think people really don't understand until they're in it how difficult it is. And it is a lot. It's, I mean, by putting your emotional and mental condition in issue in the lawsuit, you're agreeing to kind of have that aspect of your life probed and revealed and disclosed. And although there are some protections, like, there's something called a protective order where the judge says, the parties can only use this information for the purposes of the lawsuit. You can't go putting it on a website. You can't go telling everybody that this person, got therapy or whatever. But the plaintiff, has to allow the defendant who has already traumatized and invaded her in some way to, read her therapy notes and, see, in many cases what she's talked about with her therapist, other sources of stress in her life or his life, that may have nothing to do with the sexual harassment. And that's something that a lot of people have a hard time with. Why does he need to know what I went through when my father died? But that's part of it because the defense is entitled to say, all this emotional distress you're talking about wasn't caused by me, it was caused by other things that happened in your life at the same time.
And that brings me to another question for Ms. Bailey. In a circumstance like this, what do you, how do you view the therapeutic vehicle as a necessity, how it should be exercised, uh, things like that?
Absolutely. And as we know, when it comes to mental health, we're all in different stages, right? So certainly meeting the person where they are, providing that empathy, warm support, because again, where somebody may be in one case, another may be in another mindset, right? So especially when it comes to client clinician care, being that open resource, because again, different steps of the process can certainly feel very lonesome, overwhelming. And when somebody's retelling their story even over and over, maybe in depositions and things like that, I mean, they're reliving it. So it's very difficult for them.
Absolutely, absolutely. And do you have, and if you can't share, feel free to be like, I'm sorry, I can't share that. But do you have any clinical advice for people undergoing this? Because it's obviously a very tough thing to go through.
Yeah, so, and I think this is something that we speak on very often as clinicians, like commending people for picking up the phone, for joining that telehealth conference, for, coming into the office as well. It's not easy to take that initial step, but, again, being that great collaborative provider that you can be as a clinician, um, you know, meeting the person where they are, hey, maybe it was a rough week for them, maybe they skipped their last session, but the accountability factor, helping them continuing to show up, that's crucial. Hopefully that answers your question, Aaron. If you need me to elaborate more, I can. I know, of course, we can't divulge client information specifically, but that's just kind of the general overview. What we may view as a crisis may not be what someone else has as their crisis, right? But in these cases, particularly, when it becomes like your whole life until the finish line of a case, right? It's going to take a lot of your mental and emotional energy.
Um, so, Ms. Ricketts, what are some tips that you might have for staying calm and prepared during a difficult deposition process?
That's kind of a tough one. What I usually do to prepare clients that seems to reassure a lot of people is to kind of really just explain what the purpose of the deposition is, right? They're being evaluated as a witness. Are they likable? Are they credible? Are they easy to push their buttons? And I just tell them that you need to be yourself, tell them the way you told me, because that is what got us to take your case, right? Because we believed you. And, if you tell that same story in deposition, it's fine. Where people, I think, struggle is they know that this person's an adversary. And so they're different in deposition and they feel different and they feel more defensive. So I really try to encourage them to just stay focused on their story and don't pay attention to what the defense is trying to do.
That's a really good point, because I think that it it can, like, it's obviously a very difficult thing, as Ali alluded to. You're retelling and reliving something that was horrific over and over again, and the defense, in my understanding, in a lot of cases, is trying to erode your credibility, which includes, making you seem more emotional or unreliable. So that, to my understanding, is can be a very difficult process. To kick it over to Ali, what on the therapy end do you think, or on the mental health end, do you think that uh, that clients can do to prepare themselves emotionally? Because I think that there's a dual side of it, understanding the logical part of it, but also getting yourself in a place where you may not, it's harder to get you riled up or emotional or defensive or anything like that.
Yeah, so I would certainly say in a therapeutic sense of, identifying what the coping mechanisms are, right? Because if someone feels as though, there's a lot of dust flying in the air right now and waiting for the dust essentially in their life to settle again after the case has been completed, identifying maybe what easy things they can do on their own in these more crucial moments, right? Because I imagine a client would feel maybe shame, they'd feel anger, they'd feel frustration, almost like the different stages of grief, right? Because we're grieving maybe what that experience prior was or our lifestyle prior to this experience. So, certainly working alongside of the client, trying to figure out those coping mechanisms that can help them. Because again, when we are maybe in the courtroom, you know, we might not want our emotions to show, um, in that case.
Absolutely. Um, Ms. Ricketts, I wanted to ask you about what happens, what have you seen, and if you're unable to share, please let me know. But what have you seen in terms of impact when a plaintiff has supportive coworkers that kind of just go silent and ghost them once the litigation starts?
That's always really hard. I'm dealing with that in a case right now. It's unbelievable. People have all kinds of reasons why they go silent. They may be afraid, they may be, just not want to go on record, but they may be afraid of retaliation at work. They're even if they're not there anymore, they may be in the same industry, they may know a lot of the same people, they may be afraid to offend, the perpetrator. There's all kinds of reasons. Um, and honestly, I think that's pretty hurtful for the person going through this because, the support is what gets people through it. And when they feel let down by somebody they thought was going to be there for them, it's really hard. It's easier when there's no witnesses and it's just all the documents or the person's story or the circumstances of what happened that you're using to make the case and they're not counting on anybody. That's easier for them.
Wow, that's terrible, but very powerful because you know one of the things that I always talk about in terms of mental health is to have your support system and to hear from you, and it makes sense that in cases like this it's often easier to not have people that you rely on to support you. Is I can't imagine uh, the impact of that. Uh, which to again kick it over to Allie, what what impact have you seen when people lose that support system suddenly that they were counting on, that they thought, oh, this person has me, this person is helping me, and then it's just not there? What have you seen be the personal impact of that shift?
Absolutely, Aaron. That's a really great question. I would certainly say that the person may lose their own self-identity because maybe for a very long time, if you've been with one particular workplace and you've built that, we'll say, family or community sense within the workplace, you know, almost as though the client may feel, hey, like that was my life for X amount of time. These were my core people, but now where do I go? Who do I have? And a lot of resilience comes in and is a factor because I think the client has to, essentially pick themselves up, find new support systems that can be in place for them, and, ultimately go through this process maybe with limited support or alone. And that can really feel and look isolating for them.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Um, this brings to mind another question that I had about the environmental and cultural impact on the individuals and the cases themselves. And this is for both of you. I'll ask Ms. Ricketts to answer first. But what have you seen in terms of the the environmental, the cultural at a specific company, or the social and societal impact on clients that are undergoing this process?
Can you, what do you mean? The environmental and like societal, what do you mean?
Sorry, like in this situation that we were just talking about, where a client just loses their support system, people that are backing them step out and are no longer backing them. I imagine, and I could be way off base, so please correct me if I'm wrong. but I imagine that that stems from a cultural issue at the companies or within, you know, potentially the backing support structure itself. And I don't, I'm just curious about how that tends to impact cases and the individuals that are involved in the cases. Hopefully, I explained it better.
Well, I think that it's kind of a universal dynamic, at least in this country, that witnesses are always making a calculation of, is this going to hurt me more than I can tolerate? Is this going to be such a negative thing for me that it just doesn't make sense for me to stand up for my friend? And yeah, some companies have such a kind of repressive and retaliatory culture that every employee there knows they can't risk it. And, particularly if it's a small industry, like you see this in the entertainment industry, right? Like you can be, you get one person saying, "Oh, she's tough to work with," and you may never work again. So, and that's allowed many sexual harassers in the entertainment industry to just operate unchecked for decades, and we've seen that. So, yeah, it does depend on the industry itself a lot of times. It's easier in industries where people come and go a lot, and there's just a lot of people. So, like, the hospitality industry or the retail industry, yeah, sure, people are happy to step up and tell the truth. The good thing is, I think we do have a strong culture also of telling the truth. And if you're identified as a witness, a lot of people take that very seriously and they're afraid maybe, but they often do step up.
It's wonderful to hear. Uh, Ali, if same question.
Absolutely. I would kind of as well turn it a little bit with different regions and different cultures, cultural backgrounds. I know in some cultures we may see that it's difficult to, open up and, share different personal experiences. Again, just for the sake of concerns of being shamed and being potentially embarrassed or, all of the other emotional and mental hurdles that could be seen when we may share personal information about ourselves.
Absolutely. Uh, Ms. Ricketts, how often would you say plaintiffs underestimate the emotional disruption and invasiveness that comes with litigation until they're deep inside of it and kind of past the point of no return?
Hmm. Yeah, that's always a conversation that we have to have at the outset because, especially with sexual harassment cases, because they're so difficult emotionally. That's something that every lawyer tries to impress upon the client. Like, hey, a big thing is like we talked about earlier, the therapy records. A lot of people are like, I just can't have this person seeing my therapy records. I don't want that. And so some people will drop out of the process just naturally. But no matter how much we try to let them know, hey, there's going to be a deposition. You're going to have to sit there for 7 hours while someone makes it sound like you're lying, and they're going to make it sound like they don't believe you, and it's going to feel horrible, and you're going to have every aspect of your life probed and examined. There's nothing, there's nothing to quite prepare people until they're actually in it, I think.
That's that's tough. So, Miss Bailey, I wanted to ask, what do you see as the mental health consequences of being in this situation and continuing to be in this situation and in a lot of cases forced to continue to be in this situation while a plaintiff is around their alleged harasser.
Absolutely. Another great question because, we don't always think about what that is like for, the individual. I would certainly say that, And I say this because in therapy, right? Like we talk about things, we encourage the person to talk. But in cases like this, in particular, it's one of those things where the person's exhausted from talking about it and certainly exhausted being around that other party. So reminding them that they are strong, helping them to build upon themselves of, these are my inner strengths. I can get through this because I say if we tell ourselves something enough, it's just like if we say, I should do this, I should do that, I can't do this, I can't do that. Well, we can turn that around to the more positive statements, right? And uplifting ourselves and being there for ourselves in that situation. Hopefully that answers your question.
And if I can just
No,
add to
no, it's
that,
Yeah,
absolutely.
um, I find that as difficult as these things are for everyone, I do find that a lot of clients derive a lot of strength and support just from the fact that they're able to, tell their story. They're able to tell the truth. They're able to come out and be open with this thing that they've been carrying privately, maybe for a long time.
yeah,
And they feel they derive a lot of meaning from the fact that now this person can't hide anymore. If they're doing it to someone else, that person may feel more free to come forward. They're kind of giving permission to other people not to tolerate the same behavior. And I think they really derive a lot of meaning from that, at least all the clients I've worked with.
absolutely. And Morgan, just to piggyback off of that, I've seen that as well. Like, wow, like I've passed the baton to you, clinician or, counselor kind of a thing where now I have other people that are behind me during this more difficult journey.
No, and again, I might be off base, but I know in trauma work that I've done, there's a uh, there's a perspective shift that can happen where uh, you know the client goes from viewing themselves as the victim to kind of viewing themselves in a more heroic light, like, hey, I'm able to stand up to this, I'm able to confront this. And this is a question for both of you. Do you think that process is important to success, both personally and in the sense of this case? Or a case rather.
I can say two things. I feel that virtually every client I've ever worked with, if they make it through the whole process, they do undergo that transition and they do feel much more, what's the word? I'm blanking. They feel a lot more autonomy and like agency is the word I'm looking for. And they feel better by the end, you know, almost regardless of the outcome. And I would say also that that's a very good thing because it's hard to succeed if you're kind of down in the dumps and, wallowing and kind of ruminating and, just feeling sorry for yourself. It's hard to affirmatively take steps that are going to help you succeed in a lawsuit.
Yeah. I agree with that, Morgan. I certainly do. And, something else that I think of as well is, the aftermath of it, right? And this is just from the counseling perspective. Sometimes it does come back as trauma. We might see it with different cases in our professional work. And, with thinking about it, a person 3 months after the closure of that case may say, hey, like, I'm having recurring nightmares. I'm having recurring thoughts. And these are very distressing for me. But again, that's why I always say, it's helpful to have your alliance in place of, I know my supports, but to your point, the biggest supportive factor is yourself by getting through it and being, mindful of what you need through the process.
Absolutely, absolutely. And Miss Riggins, I'm curious on your end, as a lawyer who works on these cases, how often do you see mental health support, emotional support being essential to the success of the case?
I would say it's pretty often. Most sexual harassment victims, sexual abuse, sexual assault are really struggling. This is not just a minor thing that happened in their life, particularly if they're taking the step of filing a lawsuit. So they typically do have therapy already, or they're already looking for it, or they're already interested in it, even before they come to the law firm. And if there's some barrier, like, they feel like they don't have insurance or they can't afford it or something like that, then, sometimes they need a little bit of a nudge. But yeah, I mean, I usually don't have to tell my clients to get therapy. Um, but what I usually say is, hey, this is important for your life. You need to do this regardless of this case. You're having these issues. I'm noticing when I'm talking to you that you're crying. I'm noticing that you're having a hard time getting through this discussion, And so if I can't work with them without re-traumatizing them, we need to have therapists involved.
Absolutely. Absolutely. That makes a ton of sense. Um, Another question I had out of curiosity in this, you talked about the difficulty of the deposition. And one of the things that I've seen, not necessarily therapists do, but friends and relatives do when people undergo trauma, is to encourage them to embrace the negative emotion. And what I mean is, like, in this case, okay, the deposition is difficult for you, but it's also difficult to the harasser. And is there some is there some value to that in terms of, and Ali, please feel free to chime in because I feel like I would love the clinical perspective on this as well. But is there some value to hey, this is tough for you, but also remember that you're encouraging this person not to do this again, regardless of the outcome, because they don't want to go through this again. Um, is that something that happens that clients draw strength from, or is it more entirely internal rising above?
Oh, 100%. 100%. The clients are often very motivated when they think about the fact that this is, even if they, and this is before they know whether they're going to win or if anything's going to come of this lawsuit, but they know that this person got served. Their employer may know about this now. They've had to get lawyers. They've had to prepare for their deposition. They've had to answer all these questions in written discovery. It's been a huge inconvenience for them. It's been embarrassing for them. And yeah, they're thinking, the clients are thinking, hey, if nothing comes of this, at least they'll think twice next time they do this because they at least had to get hauled into deposition and maybe court. And all the more so when it's trial, because then it's really kind of brings it home that there's people from the community are listening to this, and the defendant had to be here for, a whole week. They had to take off work. They had to sit there and listen to me in front of a judge tell what happened. And that had to be like horrifically embarrassing for them, if nothing else.
And I agree with that, and that was, as you were speaking, what I was thinking of as well, the trial. Um, I know sometimes, when I've heard with and spoke with clients, maybe going through cases, being able to just tell that portion of the story of, how it's impacted their life, maybe look at the person in the eye or just be in the same presence as them and stating, this is what's happened to me and how it's impacted my daily functioning and those around me, my interpersonal relationships. Um, from what I can say of what I've heard from clients who've been impacted by various cases, they always say it just felt like that the weight of the world was lifted off my shoulders. Even if the person may not have seemed like they were listening, I was able to tell it from start to finish and not be maybe interrupted during the trial.
Yeah.
Because I
This is
think
great.
that's,
I like hearing from your perspective because it's not often that I, chat with the therapist about, especially what happens after the case. Uh,
yeah.
yeah, so this is really interesting for me.
Yeah, no, same here. I'm enjoying it because it's nice to also hear from the legal perspective. I don't have a background in law, but I have the background in the clinical set. So it's very interesting to hear specifics of, how these cases become, maybe what they become, and how we get to those outcomes, because it is helpful for me as a clinician and educator of, these different topics. So I appreciate you.
Yeah, yeah, thank you.
I think that's why we have these webinars and we have these discussions is because in situations like this, it's really about the the plaintiff and the client or patient getting to a better sense of self, a better feeling for their life, and just feeling more in control of their life. And that is in my opinion, and please feel free to disagree with me, but that is a collaborative effort that requires a lot of support for clients in these cases. And so I want to again thank you both for joining us and having what I think is a very important conversation. Um, I wanted to circle back to Ms. Ricketts about this idea, and I've heard it from a lot of, for lack of a better word, toxic workplaces where just don't rock the boat. Don't upset the dynamic that already exists. What what do you see in terms of like guilt or personal perception uh, of responsibility when a client comes to you with that kind of from that kind of culture?
Mm. That's a tough one for me because a lot of firms do different things. In our case, we usually don't accept cases where they're still working there. So a lot of times they've actually been terminated or they've had to quit. Um, so they're not really thinking about the workplace dynamic as much. But I have talked to a few potential clients who are still in the situation, and it seems to me that they're being so harassed. I mean, it's not just once a week or, even, once a day sometimes. Sometimes it's really bad. And they're just like, I can't quit this job. What do I do? And I really haven't heard much in the way of guilt about blowing up the dynamic. They're just desperate. They're in survival mode. I can't say that that doesn't exist. I'm sure it does. It's just I haven't personally encountered that. I'd be curious what Allie has to say.
Yes, thank you. And I was thinking about that as well. I have heard specifically of cases where, we've maybe built up a reputation at work, kind of like what we were discussing earlier, the different dynamics of what we would say, like that community work setting, right? Of, well, I don't want so and so to think such and such of me if I, step away from the role or if I speak up about it. So, I have definitely, in my profession, seen and heard different theories of that and different experiences by the client. Um, don't want to disrupt the workplace, but even so, well, if I quit this job, I'm a single person living on my own. How am I going to afford groceries if they have children, if they're the primary financial keeper in the home? Um, yeah, just a lot. I could go down the long laundry list of it, but many, many factors contributing to maybe why someone may be afraid or fearful to speak up.
Absolutely. So, Ms. Ricketts, you brought up something that Allie and I have had discussions about a few times, and that's this idea of survival mode, where when a person, client, whoever gets into survival mode, there's certain things that just aren't important to them anymore, and there's certain there's certain decision making processes that become skewed. Uh, and this is again a question for both of you. Do you view the survival mode instinct, which is totally understandable in this circumstance, as a beneficial thing or something that needs to be overcome so that they can approach this situation logically and rationally?
Oh man. So from a legal perspective, right, which is only one perspective, right? There can be many perspectives, but legally speaking, it usually is not helpful because when you're in survival mode, you're doing things that are not necessarily rational from the outside, right? From some other person watching what you're doing, it doesn't seem like what they would do if they were in the situation because they're not in the situation and they don't know. But they're sitting there as maybe as a juror or as a judge or as an opposing counsel, and they're saying, well, why would you agree to go on a work trip and stay at the same hotel as your sexual harasser? Like they're thinking, well, that's not rational. Why didn't you just, volunteer to book the trip and get two different hotels or, something they're thinking there's all these ways you could have acted differently and you didn't. And here's this person who's just trying to survive and they're afraid to lose their job. They're afraid to trigger the harassers, wrath or whatever. And so they're just trying to make the best decision they can under the circumstances. And they don't always necessarily remember all those circumstances that led to them making that decision in the moment. So they're not the best at justifying, well, why did you respond to that text message? Why didn't you, take advantage of the confidential hotline at your work? There's all kinds of things that people after the fact love to judge and ask in hindsight, that survival mode doesn't permit people to behave in that logical, rational way in the moment.
Definitely. And I've seen clients where, well, we'd work together on our rational mind skills, right? Like, so we'll be thinking maybe very impulsively, like to your point of texting right back to something that maybe legally, maybe it would have been best in their favor for certain cases to not respond to certain things that are they're posted or sent to them in that moment. But yeah, identifying ways of, when you see something pop up, this may be the way to respond. Maybe if the phone is a trigger for you from, certain events, let's put the phone away and take 20 minutes away from the phone and put some breathing mindfulness exercises on YouTube. Just some different ideas there, just based on what I've seen. But certainly people, um, we all go through and walk through life differently. I always say, um, and it does become that barrier emotionally for someone that may not have those skills yet. And that's, I think, why the therapeutic relationship is very crucial because we can work with them on that.
And if I can just add too,
Yes.
quite often predators, we know this, right? They select people to go after, and they're not choosing the person who's super rational, super logical, who's like been standing up for themselves for the longest time and who like feels very comfortable voicing their, discomfort in the workplace, who, has a lot of pull or a lot of respect in the workplace that, that they would be able to just snap their fingers and make some sort of problematic behavior stop. They're going after people who are young, who are inexperienced, who are naive, who are already, damaged in some way, who are vulnerable for whatever reason. And they know that, and they're picking that person for that reason. And they also know if they need to go through a course of grooming to get that person to the point where they can do, whatever they want to do, or if this person is so vulnerable already that they can just kind of overpower them. And so it's really very insidious in a way.
Yes.
That that brings up an important point that I would love to dig into is the concept of grooming, because my understanding of it, and it's very limited, is that grooming is essentially using psychological tools to prepare somebody for later being a victim of, of the predator, basically. Is that is that is my understanding correct in
I'm gonna defer that over to Ali, and he's hear what the professional has to say.
Well, and I mean, to me, when it comes to cases like this, and I was just gonna also chime in again about what we were talking about, but the way I see it is people come to us in survival mode, right? And we see that people are just surviving. And I say it like that because that is a quote in different terminologies and different phrasing that I've heard by clients, right? I was just surviving. I was not living. And when we come to where we are in the after closure, or the aftermath of different circumstances and situations, it's almost like we're looking in with the microscope and saying, wow, like, this was where we were, but this is where we are now. And I certainly think that it takes incredible strength to be able to get through certain situations, cases, and working alongside of a collaborative team. If you need me to elaborate more on your questionnaire, and I know I kind of went a little on my own tangent, please, let me know, correct me. But I just try to bring things full circle, especially when it comes to the vulnerability of a client that may not have felt that inner strength for themselves until maybe they've went through something like this to identify that, hey, I am a strong person. I can do this. I'm capable of anything.
No, I mean, thank you for that answer. I was more thinking that, as you put it, Miss Ricketts, like the practice of grooming, to me, in what I see and read, is coming out more and more as a very insidious, if not overtly illegal practice that's really rooted in doing the opposite of what clinicians do, which is slowly eroding the mental health uh, of their victim. Is that is that an accurate assessment?
So when I say grooming, I'm referring to like you said, slowly eroding their boundaries and, finding a way to bring up their date, and, then next time they're talking about did they sleep with the person? And the next time they're, asking about, you know, something that is like inappropriate for the workplace. And, maybe at some point they show them a picture of somebody, and and it just kind of becomes this thing where at first it didn't seem like it was targeting this person, or maybe it was targeting the person, but it was very mild, just saying, oh, your hair looks beautiful today or something. And over time, it just gets to be more and more aggressive and more invasive until finally they're, telling this person we're soulmates and you need to, leave your husband and go out with me, and or whatever they're doing. And so what I find is that there are some people who are initially resistant, and they're not, initially showing a lot of signs of cooperation or anything. And then this sexual harasser just keeps after it over a period of months or years. And finally, this person, for whatever reason, they're in this situation. They don't feel like they can get out of it. They don't feel like there's an easy way. They don't feel like they have resources. They don't feel like they have support. And, before you know it, it's kind of evolved into this crazy situation. But again, they're not responding necessarily in this like logical, rational way, because they have this whole long history of being trained to respond in a certain way to this harasser.
Yeah, and I think of it in like the mental health sense as well, like um having different beliefs. So we would say like that's cognitive dissonance. And for example, maybe the person is saying to the client, well, had been saying to the client, like, nobody understands you how I do. It's like a calculated, potentially response to that person to isolate them from maybe what other supports that they have had or have. And I say supports because we always have our own support, right? So, the identity of the person becomes stripped down essentially, and they identify that other party as, well, they understand me in different ways than maybe others do. And that's where my mind does go when it comes to like when we're discussing the grooming, because it's not always an overnight thing. It is an overtime experience. And, I say we are at work quite a bit of time in our life. You know, 40 hours, 50 hours a week we're working. So we might be working alongside other people that may trigger us, or have us to also begin to think and feel differently about ourselves. So it is a big chunk of time that we see these things.
I love what you said about eroding those supports, Allie, because yeah, that brings up in my mind a lot of anecdotal cases where, it can be incredibly manipulative, where the harasser is telling the victim, oh, so and so, your coworker told me that, you're incompetent or whatever, spreading kind of rumors to that may not be true and often are not true or exaggerated, to put this person in a position where they feel like this harasser is their lifeline, is their only ally, is their only support. And they stop talking to these other coworkers. They stop thinking that anyone else is there for them except the harasser. And so then they also are the source of all this abuse. And, now what do? They're trying to work it out with the harasser, maybe trying to please the harasser because, maybe they think that the harasser is the key to their career, key to their promotion, key to their job security.
Yeah.
There's a lot of complicated dynamics at play.
Absolutely. And even in the aftermath of it, like a trust deficient, right? Like, that person that I thought I could trust, that was the harasser, led me into a trap. So how do I know maybe in my next potential workplace, I'm not going to be tricked again or trapped again?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I imagine in these circumstances, especially in the case of grooming and as you've indicated, it builds over time and tends to seem innocuous uh, at the beginning. I imagine from a litigation perspective, you're looking at building a pattern of behavior that points to, hey, this was intentional grooming, uh, this was somebody maliciously intending and trying to achieve this result. Whereas on the defendant side, they're trying to look at the individual instances and say, okay, in this specific circumstance, your action, as you've indicated, doesn't make sense. Are you able to share two questions? The client process in what they go through in looking through the individual instances and your process in essentially building a case of, hey, this is what we're looking at.
Yeah, and that I think is one of the great weaknesses of the legal system in general, because we can't take every case where we believe the person. We can only take the case where we can prove it, right? So like if they have text messages and they have, emails and they have this proof, then we can work with that. And if they're a person who can explain to us, why did they respond to that late night text that was inappropriate? Why did they respond that night? Why didn't they say, hey, please don't text me anymore or something else? If they're a person who has those resources to be able to kind of defend their actions, then we can take the case. If there's somebody who's, quieter and really maybe doesn't have the wherewithal to be able to stand up under scrutiny, then a lot of times we can't end up helping them. And so that, it's really an unfortunate thing. That's the other side of the adversarial system. Do we get to the truth with a high rate of success? Yes, but we also miss a lot of cases where there is more truth out there.
Yeah.
Ali, on the other end of this, what do you what do you see or what do you recommend from the clinical side where there is a person who maybe just doesn't have the evidence or the supporting structures or things that they might need in order to litigate a case against their harasser? Uh, what what can they do on a personal level, on a psychological level, to essentially find their power and find their voice again?
Absolutely. So in therapy, right, like we would use different dynamics and different theoretical orientations to be able to identify maybe what could be looked out for if, this is something that's recurring. Certainly by, the recommendation of the legal provider that they were working with, or had told them, hey, like right now we may not have enough evidence. That said individual can work with us on, you know, rebuilding like the boundaries with themselves and potentially others, collecting what evidence they may need if they are trying to continue to pursue the case. But I would say, really working with that person to untangle the web of guilt and shame, because that can really be a big deal, for somebody that, may have, been manipulated or been a victim in a case such as this. Sometimes, we've seen, many people who have come in for therapy stating, was it my fault? You're the professional, just tell me, like, wasn't my fault, but it was the responsibility of the perpetrator, not the fault of the person who was targeted.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So we are about out of time for this webinar, but I want to give both of you the chance for some final words and of wisdom, whatever it may be, um, for the people that will eventually watch this. Morgan?
Hmm. Words of wisdom. That's a high bar. Um, I guess I would say if you're thinking about pursuing a lawsuit, yes, it's very difficult. It's a long road. If you're going to do it, commit to it, and it will probably help you in the long run, one way or another. It will help you process it. It will help you, confront the people that wronged you, and it will, I think, allow you to move on in a way that may not otherwise be available. So I think it's a good thing for that. On the other hand, it is a lot of work. So if you're the kind of person who's like, you know what, I'd rather just talk to my therapist and move on, that's great too. Not every wrong needs to be addressed in the legal system, but it needs to be addressed somehow. So, I would encourage you to do that however you need to.
Absolutely. I love that. And, I think that sometimes we may see victims, reaching out, feeling like this is a defeat, like, oh no, I'm picking up the phone and this is my next step. I know it's going to be difficult, but I think it's a very, courageous declaration that, the person is ready to reclaim their peace and their life. And again, it might be a challenging process. There might be a lot of, self work within it, but it's there to help you, and you can help yourself.
Howie Mandel here. Do you ever feel like you're just another ticket in a long line, especially when you're looking for help with something as personal as your own mental health? Lamco Wellness is bringing the human connection back to mental health care. It starts with a personalized intake process where they get to know you. They offer medication management that's actually managed, coordinating with you and your clinician to make sure you're both empowered and on the right track. It comes down to three things: personal connection, compassion, and absolute privacy. Stop being another number and head over to lamcowellness.com to take the first step.
Thank you both so much for doing this, for joining us, for getting this message out there. And I want to say, if to anybody who might be viewing this, if you or somebody you know or love is going through this, reach out. The people at Hadsell Stormer are obviously very empathetic and understanding, as well as uh, talented. Lamco Wellness provides support for this type of thing, or even if it's not one of us, anybody, somebody. Um, I think that the more people who reach out and talk about things like this, the easier it becomes for us as a society to decrease their occurrence.
Absolutely.
So, thanks again, everybody.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.